This episode of The Edge is brought to you by Audible.com, offering more than 180,000 titles for smartphone, tablet, and desktop. To get a free audiobook of your choice and help Trek.fm at the same time, visit audibletrial.com/trekfm. And also by Enterprise in Space, an international program of the nonprofit National Space Society. Find out how you can help science and education and become a virtual crew member aboard the NSS Enterprise Orbiter by visiting enterpriseinspace.org. And if you want to join the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode, join the Babel Conference, our listeners group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field. We look forward to seeing you there.
You're listening to Trek FM.
What have you done out there on the edge of Federation space?
Hello and welcome to The Edge, Trek FM show about Star Trek Discovery. I'm Mike, and today I am joined by a very special guest, Duncan from the network. Hey, how's it going, Duncan?
It's good. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing okay. I know you've been on the show before, but your main gig here on Trek FM is Primitive Culture, correct?
That's right, yes. I do a show for listeners who aren't familiar with it. Tony Black and I do a show called Primitive Culture, which is basically looking at Star Trek in terms of real-world, historical, cultural, literary. We do a bit of film as well. Basically anything that kind of feeds into Star Trek that comes from our own real-world history and culture.
Which is basically what Star Trek is, right? I mean...
Mm-hmm. Well, arguably, yeah.
what it's always trying to be and all that stuff. So that's definitely cool. And you came up with this idea where it was basically like, let's do that, but for Discovery, because of course, just like everything with Discovery, it's the new thing. Everyone's been talking about that stuff in relation to the rest of the series, the rest of the franchise, but now we've got all this new stuff to talk about. So today we're going to go through the first half of season 1 and just kind of try to see what there is to see, I guess, along the way. So we've broken it down into a couple of sort of like episode groupings, since the episodes are, rather serialized and whatnot. But we'll just start at the beginning with the 2-hour pilot, the Vulcan Hello and the battle at the binary stars. So what can we see here which relates to the real world?
Well, there were a few things that kind of jumped out for me from these two episodes. The first thing, I guess, the sort of big thing, was centering around the character of T'Kuvma. And I know, obviously, when we went into those first episodes of Discovery, I mean, I remember, we'd heard all about this character. We sort of thought this was going to be the villain for the whole series. It was a bit of a shock when he got killed off so early. But I think he was quite a divisive character in some ways, because there was this issue about the dialogue being spoken in Klingon. A lot of people, some people liked that, other people didn't like that. But particularly Chris Obi's delivery as T'Kuvma, very slow, very measured, quite different to how we've heard Klingon being spoken before. And some people were saying, is this, he was struggling to learn his lines, he was only there for a week or whatever, and he couldn't quite get his head around the lines. One of the things it made me think of, actually, particularly going back and watching those episodes again, is T'Kuvma in particular seems like he's speaking a very stylized kind of Klingon. And what it made me think of actually was Hitler. If you think about Hitler and the Nuremberg rallies, Hitler had that kind of very stylized model of speech, not a kind of normal speaking voice at all. And that was all part of his kind of cult of personality and this kind of, sort of idea of who he was as the Führer and so on. And I think there are other connections between T'Kuvma and Hitler that jumped out to me. There's this kind of issue, which was the case with Hitler, that he's not from nobility, he's not from the kind of traditional rulers. And with T'Kuvma, you've got this sense, he's not from a great house. He's had to kind of claw his way up. The kind of more aristocratic Klingons, in a sense, look down on him, just as in Germany, the kind of counts and barons and so on actually often were quite snobbish rubbish about Hitler. You know, they saw him as this sort of upstart corporal, basically, who'd somehow managed to win the people round to his cause, and they were quite suspicious of him in some ways. And of course, obviously, there's something in the kind of this idea, remain Klingon, this intense nationalism. I mean, a lot of people I know at the time were seeing it in terms of Trump and kind of American politics now, and, you know, kind of, for want of a better word, modern fascism. But I think if you look at it equally, you can see those kind of historical parallels to fascism in the 20th century. And some of those ideas about, you know, the way he describes the Andorians and the Tellarites, these disgusting species, and the kind of, and the idea of the Federation as this kind of melting pot, which to him is really revolting. The idea of these different species coming together as friends. It's hard to tell with that speech. It almost sounds like he's talking about miscegenation. It almost sounds like he's talking about them actually interbreeding, which of course, you know, well, we do have, say, with Spock, for example, you know, in Sarek and Amanda, there you have Vulcans and humans interbreeding. I don't know if we've seen any interbred Andorians or Tellarites or so on, but, you know, certainly that kind of theme is in there. So that was one of the things that jumped out to me about T'Kuvma, was that idea of this kind of intense style of presentation of self, this kind of idea of someone who rallies the people round to this cause. And Sarek talks about him as this rare unifier who's going to use a war as a cause to kind of put forward his vision of Klingon nationalism. And certainly that's what we see with him.
It's kind of interesting because, like, I never really would have thought of T'Kuvma as being a Hitler type of character, just because I think, you know, when you think of Hitler, you think of, you know, there's obviously a certain image which you conjure up in your mind, which is like, you know, the worst person ever kind of thing, you know. And with T'Kuvma, whether it's because that portion of the story really is being told from his perspective, or whether it's because sort of all of the advanced press which was going on, and the idea of, like, there are no good guys or bad guys, there's Klingons and there's humans and whatever, whether it was all of that stuff playing in. But like, T'Kuvma to me feels like a very sympathetic character in a lot of ways, you know? So it's kind of interesting. Like, I never really would have on my own considered him to be sort of like a Hitler parallel, but like the stuff that you're describing, I mean, it makes total sense.
I think one of the interesting things about Discovery is the way, you know, it does make you see things from the Klingon perspective. I mean, I sort of noticed rewatching these first 9 episodes, you know, for this, L'Rell's character, who I love as a character, and I love the actress, does a fantastic job. I think she's one of the most interesting of the Klingons. And you feel instinctively quite sympathetic towards her, I suppose, because she goes through, you know, she's mistreated and so on by Cole. But at the same time, she does really awful things. I mean, like the way obviously we don't quite know what the situation is with Tyler and so on, but she is a torturer. She is a pretty sinister, nasty person. She has her own agenda. I mean, I think it's interesting. We tend to sympathize with these people because, like you say, we see things from their perspective to some extent, and we understand at least some of what their goals are and so on. But the same could be said, I mean, controversially, there was that film Downfall. I don't know if you've seen that, about Hitler's final days in the bunker. And a lot of people had an issue with that because they felt that it humanized Hitler to a certain extent. You know, I mean, it obviously wasn't sympathizing with anything that he'd done or any decisions he'd made or so on, but it kind of, you did watch it and you felt a measure of sympathy for this man who'd ended up in this situation, however awful he was and however much he deserved it and so on. And I think that comes in some ways just from taking a character seriously in a way, whether they're a historical character or a fictional character. But, you know, and from the actor's point of view, they're always going to do that to some extent. They're not going to play a totally moustache twirling villain and, you know, give them no sympathy whatsoever. I mean, you could say the same about Khan. You know, Khan is quite a sympathetic character and it makes him an interesting villain. And obviously, you know, we know now things about Hitler, you know, that maybe people didn't know at the time and so on, and that colour our concept of him. But I guess I'm more thinking of him from a sort of German perspective in the 1930s, in the kind of early 40s and so on. You know, who is this very charismatic guy who somehow managed to sell this idea to these people, you know, that is quite different to what they've heard before in a way. And also, similarly, like Germany coming out of that kind of Weimar period, coming out of this very chaotic period, and this person, as Sarek says, a unifier, someone who will pull the country together. And of course, in Germany, in a horrific way and with catastrophic consequences for the world. But, there's something there of that person who's the person for the moment who can, steer that country in a way at that time and really summon that kind of power. And I think you do get a sense with Takugma, although he's not around for very long, he has achieved something by the end of those first 2 episodes. He has kind of changed the balance of power in terms of Klingon politics and so on. And that will have repercussions going forward.
Yeah, even though it was a way which he probably didn't even quite intend, but and I guess that is sort of been Discovery's sort of like mission statement from the beginning, which is the idea of like complex characters and not, putting things into sort of black and white, categories. The idea that, the main character in this movie is, a mutineer. The idea that the captain of the ship is very, very questionable in terms of his morality and everything like that. And the fact that, yeah, we can sympathize with someone like Takuvma, even though, he is very villainous in his intent in a lot of ways. So, I mean, you're right that does make for good drama. And it really, I think, sort of like helps to hit home a lot of, points that they might be trying to make because, it makes you think about it without just sort of like, force feeding it to you in a certain way or that sort of thing. So, yeah.
I mean, he's using war for political means as well. He's, he basically is engineering a war with the Federation. There's no, I mean, I know he might say there's a dispute with the Federation in terms of they talk about this idea of a bit of what we had hinted at in the trailers for Beyond, this idea the Federation has expanded too much. They're kind of encroaching on people's territory and so on. But really, it's just a pretext. It's, the war is what's going to get the Klingons to finally come together because they've got a common enemy. And so in a sense, he's just using the Federation to that end in order to kind of gain his own power within a kind of Klingon sphere of influence.
Yeah. He talks a good game, but his motives may not be what they seem. So, okay, well, should we move on to the next episode? Context is for Kings.
Sure. I guess for me, the thing that obviously stands out, doing a history and literature and culture podcast, of course, is the book Alice in Wonderland. I mean, Tony and I talked about, I think when it was first announced that Nicholas Meyer was going to be working on Discovery, we sort of thought, right, well, he's the guy who really brings literature into Star Trek. What's he gonna bring in this case? What kind of literary references are there going to be? And here we have, not just kind of literary parallels, but we have physically an actual book turning up, just as in the Wrath of Khan we had these big hardback books turning up and playing this important role. I find it weird, that book that we see at the end of that episode and we see again later on in the series in Lethe is a really ugly book. I mean, we've kind of got used to in like 90s Star Trek, for example, and the Wrath of Khan, when they have real books, either you read off a pad or if you're going to have a real book, you have a nice sort of what looks like a kind of first edition hardback, attractively bound book. That book looks like it's been kind of, printed on demand or something. I don't know if it's meant to look futuristic or what, but I was kind of surprised that was as kind of classy as it gets.
I can see that the whole print on demand thing kind of makes sense because you got to figure everyone's got a Kindle, right? I mean, that's going to be the standard thing. So, if someone's like, I want a book, like that's weird. Like that's, that's like someone going to a store and buying vinyl today, and especially on Vulcan, you got to think that, the Vulcans are like, this is completely illogical. Like you are literally making no sense right now, Amanda, so yeah, if you want a quote unquote book, we can make one for you, but, we haven't had much practice at this. So, it's not going to be, it's not going to be like a nice leather bound whatever. It's going to be whatever the Vulcans kind of threw together. Kind of like when the Telosians were trying to create a person in a cage. That's like the Vulcans trying to create an actual book. Because why wouldn't you just be using your pad?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, that makes sense. Well, I mean, the other thing is, of course, like Alice in Wonderland, if you were going to pick any book from Earth literature to really confuse a load of Vulcans, that's going to be the book. It's the least logical book. I mean, it's literally a book of nonsense. So I think it's quite funny, this idea that, and Burnham says at one point that it taught her that sometimes, I can't remember how she puts it, that sometimes the world isn't logical or something, or that, there are other ways of looking at things. And I suppose that's one reading of it. On the other hand, Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass as well, they're set in fantasy worlds. I mean, especially Alice Through the Looking Glass is literally set in a parallel universe, which of course may well come to tie into other themes that have kind of come up in this half season of Discovery. We've got that weird scene with Stamets in the mirror. We've got all these hints that we might be heading to the mirror universe, there's discussions of pockets of parallel universes and ways between the universes. So definitely Alice Through the Looking Glass, the second of those two books, is kind of key to a lot of that. But actually Alice in Wonderland, going back and rereading that, there are other sort of interesting parallels. I mean, the section of Alice in Wonderland that Burnham quotes when she's running away from the tardigrade, and that she's obviously memorized as a child, is from the beginning of the book. And a long section at the beginning of the book is all about Alice taking eating different cakes and drinking potions and so on, and shrinking and growing. And basically this idea of size going, that your size can shift down or up or whatever. And of course, in this story, we have the tardigrade, which is a microscopic animal, but has been expanded to macroscopic proportions. So we've got this idea of this kind of weird distortion of scale. Why is this tiny bit? What is this? Is it a tardigrade? It's all a bit sort of unclear. Does it just happen to resemble one? And even in, I think, the next episode at the beginning of maybe it's the Butcher's Knife episode. Anyway, one of the episodes, the opening shot is of her uniform being synthesized, and we see that again at the kind of microscopic level, and we see this real kind of difference of perspective when you're down in this tiny atom kind of level, and there seems to be this huge electrical storm going on, and in fact we're just seeing the replicator from the inside producing that material. But again, there's that kind of weird disconcerting element of the scale being out, something that should be tiny suddenly being huge, which is what we have with the tardigrade as well.
Yeah, that is really interesting. And, obviously, I think the book was chosen, for multiple reasons. I mean, I think maybe the inspiration came from, that animated series episode. But obviously, I think, when they saw that there, they used that as like a springboard to, delve into these other issues and sort of like apply them to the themes of this episode in particular and the show in general and everything like that. And I think that it works really well. And, I've never read Alice in Wonderland, and, I've seen the Disney movie and I've seen the Tim Burton movie or whatever, and I don't think either of those really count. But one of the things which I've wanted to do for this show, which, we should get around to eventually, is actually like reviewing that book and seeing how it, sort of applies to disco in this particular way. I think that would make for a good episode of The Edge. We should do that. Definitely.
Well, I hadn't read it since childhood, and I went back and reread both those books this week. I know if people are interested, actually, Chris Jones did a very interesting episode of Notes from The Edge in which he talked about plot similarities between Alice Through the Looking Glass and Discovery, and mapping certain characters. And there are other things that sort of jump out to me in terms of Alice in Wonderland. I mean, the character of Harry Mudd, there's something of the kind of Mad Hatter about that. I think, there's even this joke, is he mad or is he mud or whatever? I don't know how much that sort of thing is in people's minds, but if you haven't read Alice in Wonderland, I would highly recommend, and this is, we make this plug in every episode anyway, if you go to Audible and get an Audible subscription, there is a recording of it by Christopher Plummer, which is absolutely amazing. He actually does both books. You get both, you get two for one. And Christopher Plummer, I always thought of as quite a sort of, we know he's very sort of Shakespearean. We know he's quite grand. We know he's quite stern, like if you think of The Sound of Music. We know he can be quite sinister, General Chang, etc. Christopher Plummer is absolutely hilarious in this audiobook, and extremely silly, and it's amazing. It was kind of like a sort of showreel for Christopher Plummer's repertoire of accents, because every single character has a different accent, quite broad accents, very distinct, and it's just a very joyful, bizarre, mad performance. So if you are tempted to get into Alice in Wonderland, I would definitely recommend going and listen to the Christopher Plummer version, because it's quite an extraordinary recording.
That sounds amazing. I'm sold. I think we should stop recording right now so that I can go and download that and listen to it. Yeah, and there's the Star Trek connection there too, so that's great. So cool. All right, so should we move on to the butcher's knife cares not for the lamb's cry and choose your pain?
Yeah, I sort of grouped these together because partly, I sort of found going through these episodes and preparing for this, sometimes, I don't know if you found this with Discovery, you slightly lose track of where one section of story ends and the next one begins, because there's a lot more kind of overlapping and so on.
Yeah, it's kind of a cohesive whole for sure,
So some of these things are more sort of general things. I mean, maybe we talk about something a bit more general, like Lorca, actually, as a character, and I think we get a very strong sense of some of the questions around that character in Context is for Kings. And then as the season goes on over the next few episodes, it's sort of maybe we feed in a bit more information. I mean, in Choose Your Pain, we find out a bit more about his backstory, for example. So we kind of get to understand a bit more about why he's the way he is, because when we first meet him, I mean, I was on the episode of The Edge when we just seen Context is for Kings. So we were reviewing that episode, in isolation. That was our first introduction to Jason Isaacs' character. And I think there was always this sort of question, well, you get Jason Isaacs to play this captain. Is he going to be a villain? What's the kind of role going to be? Because we associate him with playing these kind of quite dark sort of villainous roles. And I think in that first episode, he definitely plays up to a lot of the kind of traits of the villain, like sort of slightly cliched kind of film villain traits. We meet him in darkness. He's facing away from the central character. He has this disability, which is often in film used as a way of signifying a villainous character. I mean, that's a slightly problematic area, but the idea of someone who's been damaged physically in some way, he's got this kind of physical trauma, we see in later episodes. I mean, this is jumping ahead a bit to Lethe, I suppose, but we see that whole sequence with Admiral Cornwall where he's got the phaser in his bed and so on, and he's really, kind of on the edge, so to speak. We see, and one of the things that, of course, it made me think of, thinking, as I was saying, about Nicholas Meyer, thinking about literary contexts, is Captain Ahab, who is the kind of archetypal bad captain, I suppose, and features in Star Trek at various points, features in The Wrath of Khan, features in Star Trek First Contact. And one of the things that Herman Melville says about Ahab is the way he describes what's happened to him is because Ahab, he's lost his leg to this whale Moby-Dick, and it's spurred him onto this kind of crusade of vengeance. And the line is, this might be a slight paraphrase, but he says his torn body and gashed soul bled into one another, and so interfusing made him mad. And basically, I think we see that again with Lorca. He's been physically damaged in that he's been essentially blinded by what's happened to him, and he's been kind of psychologically damaged by the loss of his ship, by the fact that he had to kill all his crew basically in order to save them from a fate worse than death, he thought. And so he's definitely an extremely damaged character, and whether or not we feel a degree of sympathy for him compared to, say, when we first meet him in Context is for Kings, where he does seem he seems like a very shady character. And then, as time goes on, we maybe see more positive sides to him, and we also maybe feel an element of sympathy for him. But there's still a lot of questions around that character. And I suppose the other thing that ties into Ahab is this idea of a captain with an agenda. And when the captain's agenda is not what it's supposed to be, there's always going to be trouble. And we've seen that in Star Trek at other times, when there's someone who's in command, but they've got some mission of their own. And we don't quite know what Lorca's mission of his own is. Some people think he's trying to return to another universe. Some people think he's from the mirror universe, whatever it is, but he's clearly up to something. He's got an agenda which he's not sharing with people. And that is, essentially bad news, if you're on a ship, because, you can't really trust that person and you don't know what they're going to do next.
Yeah, I think Moby-Dick is one of those things where if you're doing any sort of like naval story, it's almost impossible to not be influenced by it in some way or another, right? And especially, this series where it's not really, well, I mean, it is, but it's much kind of a larger scale than something like First Contact or Wrath of Khan, where it's just like this one story about this, sort of like noble captain who, everyone knows and loves, who's, experiencing like a moment of weakness in a sense. But here, I mean, like, it's almost like the premise that Lorca's character is built on. And even when there are moments where we're like, oh, see, he's not such a bad guy, then, he turns around and we see, what happens in the mid-season finale, and it's like, okay, yeah, he puts on a good show, but, so, I mean, I'm very curious to see where they go with the character, but yeah, I mean, it seems like, as far as like long form storytelling is concerned, like this is one of the first times that we've really seen this in Star Trek. And I mean, you got to think that Moby-Dick has to be in some ways or another a template for that. Right.
And it's interesting. I mean, one of the things that you talked about in terms of theme, again, a sort of theme running through the series, this idea of mutiny. And, we start off in the very beginning with, Burnham becomes this character, the mutineer. I mean, before we saw those first episodes, as soon as we heard that they cast Jason Isaacs, to be honest, my prediction was we're going to have a mutiny storyline, but I expected it to run the course of the 13 or 15 episodes or whatever. And, the crew would be mutinying against him because he would be some kind of tyrannical figure. And obviously that's a kind of literary and a historical, trope in a sense as well. We have the mutiny on the Bounty is probably the most famous, example. And mutinies in a kind of naval setting, usually when you have a mutiny story, there's one of the Hornblower stories is about a mutiny as well. Usually what you have is a captain who is tyrannical, who's abusing their power over people because, a captain of a ship or a starship, they do have a lot of autonomy. They are kind of their own little king in a sense. They can impose punishments that are quite cruel. They can abuse their power over their crew. And so generally a mutiny comes about because you're dealing with, I was going to say like Captain Jellicoe. I mean, going a bit further than that, but someone who just like the boss that you can't bear to work for, and eventually people snap, and they snap en masse and revolt against that person. I actually think, to be honest, Michael Burnham is not in that sense a mutineer. First of all, she was opposing a good captain, a very good captain, but it was a point of a difference of opinion really about how to proceed that they were arguing over. And obviously she took very extreme actions in breaking the chain of command, in essentially taking over, in disabling the captain and trying to force her own view of what they should do. But it's not a mutiny in the sense of the crew rebel against the captain and take over and they're trying to depose the captain from authority and so on. It's kind of quite different. And I think it's interesting. I mean, you've mentioned this kind of naval tradition. Obviously, Star Trek's always had this kind of naval tradition. And you see it in Discovery as well. I think in the language, you see this use of the word souls to describe, the loss of lives is a very kind of nautical expression. In the second episode, the Battle at the Binary Stars, the way those ships begin that battle, quite unusual for Star Trek, these lines of ships lined up and then they just start firing at each other. It's very much the model of a sort of, 18th or 19th century naval battle, really. Very different to the kind of approach to battles that we see, say, in Deep Space Nine, where it's kind of whizzing around and sort of more like, Spitfires, aerial dogfighting, that kind of thing. So we do see these kind of flavors of that sort of nautical thing. And I guess with the punishment of Burnham at the end of those first two episodes as well, with this court-martial, of course, is a naval tradition. And a lot of people have said, life imprisonment, that seems very harsh. That seems pretty tough for the Federation. On the other hand, in those kind of nautical cultures, you'd be killed for that, probably. That would be a capital offence. And obviously, the Federation doesn't have a death penalty, but that's the closest they can get. And I suppose maybe that again gives us a sense of how seriously this crime is taken, which we can easily forget because we're used to people in Star Trek disobeying authority. They do it all the time. I mean, it's kind of, it's almost a joke, the extent to which people will go against their orders. They might get, the worst that ever happens is like Tom Paris got sent to the brig for 30 days, and that seemed really extreme for going against orders. But generally, they just get a bit of a telling off and, maybe they're grounded for a few days and then they're back to work. So it's kind of interesting, I think, bringing back that idea of, is almost a kind of exemplary punishment, and the extent to which she's been kind of socially pilloried for her role in this and blamed to an extent. I mean, really, she did not start that war, but she is that's the narrative that's being put out, is that, that she staged a mutiny and therefore started a war. And, it's not really accurate to what's happened.
Yeah, I guess, I never really thought about it in those terms, and maybe that's a fault in the show, but it does make a lot more sense if you think about it as like a Starfleet punishment instead of as like a Federation punishment. Not so much that she's breaking the law, but that she's breaking the rules. And in those terms, I guess it does make a lot more sense for that to be life in prison or whatever. I'm curious now, like, do they say like there's no death penalty in the Federation, or do they say there's no death penalty in Starfleet? I don't know. But it is interesting thinking about it like that, and yeah, I get that helps, I think, with it for me.
I would assume it's in the Federation, but I mean, it's interesting. It even comes up in Discovery because Admiral Cornwall says it to. I mean, we've heard this before. There was that Voyager episode where they talked about how they don't have the death penalty and they have a real issue with it. But Admiral Cornwall says to L'Rell, the Federation doesn't execute anyone. They won't execute prisoners. They will, they'll imprison them, basically. And that's the worst that can happen to you, in a sense. So I think it is, and she has been imprisoned for life. And I don't know whether the implication is she's been imprisoned for, like we would say, life means life. It's not life. In the real world, people get sentenced to prison in life and then maybe in 10 or 15 years they're released. The sense seems to be she's going to be locked up for good, basically. Certainly that's her expectation. She's not going to be living a free life at any time in the future. And it does seem quite extreme, but I think if you see it in the context of military justice rather than civil justice, rather than kind of civilian justice, in a sense, it does make a bit more sense. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah. Well, thanks. That helps me sort of wrap my head around something which I had a problem with early on. So I can't
really explain why the judges are lit in that sinister way, so you can't see their faces. I think that is a bit dubious. But, hey.
Okay, well, should we move on to Lethe?
Sure.
Okay. Well, here's the big question, I guess, right? What the hell does that title mean? Because I've heard the explanation like 15 times now, and I still don't know what it is.
Okay,
and
good.
If I'm pronouncing it right.
I think I can answer that. I think it is pronounced Lethe as far as I know. And this is my interpretation of what it means, but I think it actually means a lot of different things in the context of this episode. This is a wonderful episode. I think this was the first one that really made me say wow about Discovery somehow, because it really felt, it tied in very much to Star Trek, and it felt like it was doing something quite interesting. And this is Joe Minosky's episode as well, which is kind of not so surprising when you think about how kind of weird it is and how it takes place within a mind meld and all this kind of crazy stuff. It sort of makes sense. And also that it has this kind of classical literary allusion, which of course we know, if you think of Darmok, for example, we've got the Epic of Gilgamesh and so on. So this is someone who is very interested in these kind of cultural touchstones. Lethe, I know some people have said it refers to a goddess as well in ancient mythology. As far as I'm concerned, Lethe that is being referred to here is the river in the underworld. And the Lethe is where the souls of the dead, basically in the underworld, they drink from the river, and it wipes their memories of, it's like a kind of oblivion. It wipes their memories of who they were. And if you look in Virgil's Aeneid, there's a description of the process by which these souls are reincarnated in new bodies, sort of in the, to go back up to the world of the living. And basically, in order to leave the underworld, they drink from this river, and they forget who they were, and then they can go and lead a new life. Now, obviously, in Discovery, there's one character that this, it seems like quite a big hint towards, but it also ties into lots of other characters within this episode, I think. I mean, Sarek does the same thing. The whole episode is about Sarek's memory. It's a memory that he's hidden, and it's all about Burnham sort of trying to dig in and find out what's the truth of this memory. What's this thing that's been, conveniently forgotten, that's been kind of plastered over. And she does that. And then even at the end of the episode, Sarek is lying there in his hospital bed and saying that he doesn't remember any of this. He doesn't remember the mind meld, and basically refusing to engage with what's happened. So he is again choosing to forget this element of his past in order to be a different person. We see the same thing with Captain Lorca and Admiral Cornwall, that and this, some people might say this feeds the idea that Captain Lorca is from the mirror universe or whatever. She makes a remark about this time that they spent together as younger people, and they shared this bottle of brandy or something. And he clearly doesn't seem to remember it. And she says, "Oh, what have you forgotten?" To me, that does actually add fuel to the fire of the idea that, maybe he's not who we think she is. And she says when they have sex, it's not the same as it used to be, that there's something different about him. But whether that's literally true, that he's not the same person, certainly from her perspective, it's true that he's sort of forgotten himself. He's kind of reinvented himself, in a sense. And then, of course, the obvious, sort of allegory in a sense for the broader story of Discovery is, I think pretty much everyone by now is on board with this idea that Tyler and Voq are the same person. And in terms of the way we're seeing that, Tyler clearly doesn't know what's going on. He's clearly forgotten that he was someone else, if that's how we're going to put it. So he's literally he's gone through this process of drinking from the water that, erases your previous identity and allows you to go back into the world and be someone else and, and not remember that. So he's kind of, somehow or other, that process has taken place. And so I guess it sort of ties into this idea of, the character of Tyler, what's going on there. And in terms of kind of, this is a step slightly sideways, but the second episode that Tony and I did of Primitive Culture was about the Manchurian Candidate. And Tyler, it seems to me, is very much a Manchurian Candidate. He's not what we thought, a lot of people thought maybe to begin with, he was just, faking it in a sense. He was like Arm Darving, he was like pretending to be human. Clearly, he knows who he thinks he is, and he doesn't really understand what's going on. He's been kind of programmed in some way, just as we see in the Manchurian Candidate. We have, someone who, in a similar situation, has been taken prisoner as a prisoner of war, has been brainwashed, has been programmed, in a sense, hypnotically programmed, and then is being sent back to go back to his old life and to kind of pass as the person that he once was, but in fact with this secret mission and this secret agenda. And we see it again, of course, in Battlestar Galactica. We have the Boomer character who again is this kind of sleeper, sort of unconscious sleeper agent who's going to be activated at some point. And I think a lot of people have been thinking that's what's going to happen to Tyler at some point, that he'll kind of flip over into the kind of Voq personality. But definitely that ties into this theme of lethe and oblivion and this idea of forgetting who you were in order to be someone else.
Yeah, that's interesting because, obviously there's no direct reference to lethe in the episode or anything like that. And I don't even know necessarily because there's obviously a lot of things going on in the episode and there's individual things which you can sort of key off of, but by titling it Lethe, it really sort of makes you look at the entire episode in that particular context. And then I think a lot of these things do start to sort of pop up or pop out a lot more than they would just under a normal sort of reading of the episode. So in that sense, it's kind of a brilliant title because it not only just applies to what's going on in the episode in sort of an abstract way, but it also makes you view the episode through that particular lens. So that's kind of great. Now that I have an idea of what it means, it's I really appreciate that a lot more than I did.
Well, there's one of these things about Discovery, I think, is that it's been a kind of talking point that we've gone back to these quite sort of obscure titles in a sense, compared to say Next Gen, which had very kind of descriptive titles, the lost, the something, the wounded, the blah, essentially summarizing what was going to happen in that episode or what it was about. We've got these very much more sort of literary, much more original series style titles, but I think we also have a degree of mystery surrounding the meaning of them. And I think this is a more general thing with Discovery, partly because we're living in this culture, which is, it's all about spoilers and it's all about mysteries and twists and so on. And we don't know, one of the challenges of preparing for this conversation is we don't really know where this show is going. And because it's so much more serialized, a lot of these things, we can sort of make guesses as to what references are being invoked or what things mean, but actually we won't know until it's all finished and we get to the end of it and find out what their kind of master plan was and sort of what they were hinting at. And even things like, say, will come later on. But the final episode again has a title, which is a quotation, and there's this sort of mystery surrounding what does this quotation refer to? Well, what's this about somehow? And I think Lethe is definitely one of those. It's not quoted in the episode. I mean, something like "Context is for Kings" sounds very obscure and mysterious, and then we hear Lorca saying it, and we understand what it refers to, and it sort of makes sense. But you're right that Lethe, there's this element of, it's almost like a puzzle in itself to work out what's it refer to, what's the connection to the episode. None of it is explicitly stated in the way that, say, I feel like in a previous era of Star Trek, if you were going to have a title like that, it would refer to, either someone would say it in the episode, which we do get here sometimes, or it would refer to something that was quite easy to pin down and quite specific somehow, that we could say, okay, well, that's what that means. Whereas here, there is that there's slightly more ambiguity about it.
I don't know if this is me just like reading too much into this or not or whatever, but one of the things which strikes me about the titles of these episodes compared to literally every other episode of Star Trek in history is that the titles do not appear on screen. And I'm wondering if that, in a way, either gives them some leeway to title them whatever they want or influences the way they decide to title them, because it's not part of the actual piece. It is external to the thing. I mean, in a sense, the title is like an abstract thing. It's not actually, it's outside of the work. And because of that, and yet it influences the work. It's almost like it's expanded universe in a sense. You know what I mean? I don't know. It just a thought. Probably
it's paratext.
Yeah, there you go.
Not text. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think that's definitely true, and I think it's interesting that we see, for example, I think in the past in Star Trek, if they wanted to use a kind of slightly mysterious title, there was a tendency to feel it had to be explained. So if you think like Deep Space Nine, again quoting Latin, interama and in silent leges, it is translated in the episode so that you get a translation. I mean, I've recently been going back and watching the X-Files, and a lot of X-Files episodes have titles in foreign languages, whether that be Latin or German or something. And interestingly, a bit like with Discovery, they never appear on screen, and they're not explained explicitly in the episode. So you have to go away and look them up and work out what that refers to, and then apply it yourself to the episode to sort of see what the, thematic connection is or whatever. So I suppose it does. It adds that kind of extra element of a kind of mystery and a sort of ambiguity, which fits very well with the way that Discovery is developing bit by bit and kind of drip feeding us context, I suppose, as well as actual plot. We're getting drip fed the kind of, who these people are, where they come from. I mean, if you think about, say, someone like Lorca compared to, another character, say Cisco starting Deep Space Nine, he has this traumatic past, he's got all these issues, he's got a lot of emotional baggage, etc. It's all laid on the table right away. We know exactly what the issues are, we know what he's struggling with, we kind of know what's going on. Lorca, when we first meet him, is very mysterious, and it's sort of gradually we're starting to get to learn a little bit more about why he is the way he is, what his past is, how it's kind of influencing him, and so on. It's a very different approach to that kind of storytelling, I suppose. It's much less kind of linear in a way. It's more this idea that we can kind of jump around and fill in the gaps and piece something together as we go along.
Yeah. I mean, maybe we're reading too much into this. I know that's just kind of like standard operating procedure for television these days, but it is interesting to think about. And hey, if we don't overanalyze every single little piece of this show, then, I mean, can we even call ourselves Star Trek fans? So
I was just going to say, it gives us a great opportunity to get things wildly wrong, which is quite exciting in a way, which we haven't had for a very long time, to totally misconstrue what's happening in a way that I don't think we've had before. So, I might have my theory about a mutiny. I don't know. Someone else might have a theory about the mirror universe. Do you know what I mean? And we can't all be right, probably. So, some of us are going to end up eating our hats, basically, by the time all the chips are down.
For sure. The nature of fandom. Oh, well. Mm-hmm. So should we move on to the next episode? Magic to make the sanest man go mad. Is that what it's called? I think, right?
I think so. That sounds about right.
Close enough.
I'm not going to say a huge amount about this episode, mainly because Tony and I did a whole episode on this in terms of time loops and looking at Groundhog Day and looking at some of the other influences, looking at cause and effect, obviously, from Next Gen. That's the kind of big influence, I think. So I'm not going to kind of massively go into that. Another thing that struck me about it, going back to this episode, though, is a lot of people talking about the party. This is not exactly a literary, cultural, whatever, but I suppose it is a cultural point about parties. I mean, the party is very different from what we've seen in Star Trek before. Historically in Star Trek, it's, you know, if you think of Next Gen, it's like classical music concerts. If you think of Voyager, they might go to the cinema together, or they might play ping pong or something like that. But it's all quite sort of tame somehow. Do you know what I mean? There's no kind of raucous behaviour. There's no kind of wildness. This party is a lot more fun. It seems a lot more sort of boozy. There's a lot of people hooking up. There's a lot of kind of, it seems like a very different atmosphere, and it seems much more real. And one of the things that struck me about it, and one of the things that strikes me about Discovery generally, is I feel like there is a kind of influence in the back of Battlestar Galactica and the kind of characters that we saw in Battlestar Galactica, the kind of behavior that we saw, because that was a show that really showed these people as being in a military, you know, as behaving like soldiers in a military might, as letting their hair down in the way that soldiers in a real military might, as, you know, capable of kind of doing slightly reckless or thoughtless things, as more sort of flawed, real kind of people who enjoy things and make the same mistakes and kind of, you know, live in a more kind of recognizable way. They're not these kind of evolved, perfect people of the future. We see it with the swearing. I mean, you know, there's that famous scene that everyone's talked about with the swearing, but even before that, there were a couple of milder swear words in Discovery. You know, this idea that they feel much more like real people in a sense. I do think there's that influence there, and there are other influences that we could talk about from Battlestar Galactica in terms of visual influences. I think some of the kind of shots of those big cargo bays and so on, there's a kind of hint of that in some of the ways that that's presented. It doesn't quite feel Star Trek in some ways. It feels like it's come from somewhere else. But obviously the main influence on Magic to make the Sanest Man Go Mad is the kind of idea of the time loop, and that idea as a sort of sci-fi trope, and finding something new to do with that.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the party, I don't know, like, I see this thing in Star Trek where I feel like they're really, really scared of dating themselves in a lot of ways, which is why whenever they're listening to music, it's classical music which has already been around for hundreds of years. So it only, you know, stands to make sense that it will be around for hundreds of more years, that sort of thing. And there's this fear of, like, if we do something modern, we're going to look ridiculous in 10 years because that, you know, hit song today won't even be on anyone's radar 10 years from now, let alone 300 years from now. And I think what's kind of lost there is the idea that Star Trek really is about today, you know? And like you're saying, if you want to make things seem real, make things seem relatable to the audience which is watching this today, then you kind of need to go for it. And maybe it will be dated. You know, maybe they won't be listening to, you know, Al Green 300 years from now. I think they will, but whatever. You know, but it's reasonable to me for them to do this because essentially, who cares? You know, I mean, you're going to get things wrong or whatever, but you've got to sort of like go for it completely, go all out in order to make this episode as good as you possibly can for the people watching it today. And I think that they're doing that here in a way that they've been maybe a little afraid to do in the past. So I really do admire them for that.
I think that's definitely true. There's a kind of element of just going for it in a sense. And it definitely works. And I think it helps because a lot of that episode is about Burnham having this kind of anxiety about the party and not being confident going to the party and so on. It does need to feel like a real party that you might find intimidating if you were a kind of socially awkward person. And in a way, it would be harder to buy that if it was a kind of genteel drinks party in 10 Forward, that she would have that kind of anxiety. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Because her sort of stiffness and so on does stand out more in this environment where everyone is quite kind of loose and laid back, and Tilly's got her hair down, is obviously having a wild time, and it makes it all the more obvious that she is set apart and that she's kind of standing out and she's not quite able to get involved on that level.
So, okay, should we move on to the next episode, which I'm sure I'm going to pronounce wrong? CV Pacem Parabellum? Something along those lines?
Something like that, I think. Right. I don't know. I learnt a little bit of Latin at school, but it was a very long time ago. If you want Latin, you should get we often have on Primitive Culture Clara Cook as a guest, who knows all about the classics. I'm sure she could correct our pronunciation. But yeah, an interesting Latin title. If you want peace, prepare for war. I don't know how much it really has to do with this episode in some ways. I mean, I think, again, there's a sort of slightly mysterious element to it. It's certainly not a phrase that is explicitly explained in the episode. I mean, I sort of see this as a Saru episode, and certainly that's the way it was billed, was this is the kind of Saru-focused episode. So I guess that's the aspect of it that interests me, just because I think he is quite an interesting character. I think he's an interesting character for Discovery because he brings in a couple of elements, and we weren't quite sure before Discovery started, and we'd seen pictures of this character. We'd seen that one line in the trailer, which everyone had issues with, where he says, "My species were, what does he say? Predetermined, determined, something like that, to sense the coming of death or whatever." And some people loved it, some people thought it didn't make sense, and so on. And gradually we've sort of come to understand that. And I think there are two elements of Saru that interest me. One is this idea of predators and prey, and this idea of being a prey species. And he talks about being hunted, he talks about his species being hunted, but he also talks about them being farmed, about them being, essentially used like cattle, he says, basically. So he invokes this idea of farming in the way that we treat animals. And obviously I think there is this kind of theme running through Discovery about the exploitation of animals, the way that we treat animals. I mean, we see it with the tardigrade and the kind of moral issues around that. And we're kind of shocked that Saru is not more on the side of the tardigrade, being a prey species himself, as he says. And, the tardigrade is being used for military purposes, in a sense, that are very much not its natural behavior. They're not what it would do. In the same way as in the real world, we see, horses, dogs, if you think about, say, the First World War, the use of animals in that is quite a sort of an area that people are quite interested in, say the play Warhorse or whatever. We have, in the Cold War, there was the use that they were trying to train dolphins to set off bombs and do all kinds of mad things. But, this idea of sort of harnessing these animals and kind of training them to do your bidding, in a sense. And I think that sort of feeds into this idea that we get with Saru of the way that one species can be sort of exploited by another and treated as, like he says, as cattle, as, as sort of disposable beings, in a sense. But I think the other thing that we get from Saru, which is connected, is because he talks about this sensing the coming of death and so on, which, famously, whatever the scientific basis, that is what people would say, cows can sense when they're going to the slaughter or whatever. It's that kind of idea that is built into these species that are kind of exploited in that way, is this idea of Saru in terms of mental health. And I think that is a really interesting element of that character. And it goes beyond, I think in the first couple of episodes, it seems like he maybe seems a little bit ridiculous, because he seems a bit cowardly and he seems a bit sort of complaining. He's a bit sort of C-3PO, or a bit sort of Crichton in Red Dwarf. He's this kind of very risk-averse character and so on, very un-Starfleet, very unheroic. But I think as time goes on, and I think in the novel Desperate Hours we get more insight into this as well, but certainly as the series goes on, and particularly in this episode, CV Pacem Parabellum, we get this sense of, the how awful it is for him living this life in this state of fear. And he basically, as far as I can see, is someone suffering from anxiety. If you're suffering from anxiety, it can affect you in very, it's not just the obvious things. It's not just something that anyone would find scary that is more scary. It's like something quite mundane or basic, like going to the shops, can feel terrifying. So I think what we have with Saru is this idea of this character who is really engaging with, he's able to, in that kind of Star Trek allegorical way, shine a light to a certain extent on what it's like for someone living with that kind of condition, living in a perpetual state of sort of being on edge, of not feeling safe. And how someone can manage to cope with that. And obviously what we get in this episode is it's like, suddenly Saru gets medicated and all that goes away, and these Parvans kind of wipe away all these sort of issues, mental health issue really that he has. And it's kind of cured temporarily, and what transformation that is for him. So although as an episode, I think of all, probably of this first stretch, it's the one that interested me the least. I do think that Saru himself is a very interesting character, and I hope that I'm sure we'll see a lot more, and we'll see that character grow more in a way, and we'll get to know more about him, because I think these two elements of his character, they're kind of woven in there, are both independently very interesting, and as long as they continue to sort of try and take that seriously and not make it too two-dimensional, I think there's kind of a lot to play with there.
Yeah, I mean, this is something which, we've definitely talked about somewhere along the line. I can't exactly remember where, but, Brian Fuller is rather outspoken in terms of his, beliefs and with, the food industry and everything like that, the treatment of animals, just in general and everything. And, listen to him talk about what his plans were for, like the final season or the next season of Hannibal, which never got made and everything like that. And it really all sort of like ties into these same themes. So it's not at all surprising to me that he has this character in this show. I mean, that's definitely something which is a holdover from the Fuller areas as far as I'm concerned. And, it is really interesting. It's such a bizarre alien concept that, it's hard to wrap your head around. But I mean, like, they did just announce that there is a Saru book coming out, I believe over the summer. So that should definitely be interesting to read, and maybe finally get into some of this backstory and figure out how it is that his culture works, because it's hard to sort of reconcile that idea, which we're very familiar with in terms of like the treatment of animals and everything like that, applying that to like a sentient, species. So it is super fascinating on an abstract level for sure. I'm not exactly sure how invested I am in him as a character and all this stuff, but I find the concept of Saru to be absolutely fascinating.
I know what you mean, and I think that maybe part of the thing with Saru is that he's maybe not as sympathetic a character as perhaps we would have expected going into the show. Knowing that he was this sort of alien character, I think we sort of assumed he was going to be the Spock or the Data character, and really the kind of almost the character that's going to become the most popular. And actually, in some ways, he's a bit of a jerk. He doesn't always behave very well. He's kind of a bit jealous. He says himself he's jealous. He has some quite negative personality traits. He's less likable, really, than I was sort of expecting. But I do think that he's very interesting. He's definitely got a lot of interesting elements there. And I'm interested to hear you say that that's... I mean, I kind of figured he was had come from the kind of Brian Fuller era, obviously, but I didn't realise that was something that's come up in his other work as well. So I think that's quite interesting that that's a kind of angle on that. And I do think that this season of Discovery, this half season of Discovery, there is a kind of undercurrent of an interest in this idea of the treatment of the animals and so on. And I mean, we just did an episode of Primitive Culture about human rights and touching on animal rights as well. And I think it's kind of interesting, the whole issue with the tardigrade, it's not presented as this kind of legal thing. It's much more a kind of moral discomfort around the way that animal is being treated, in the same way as, in the real world, the slaughter of animals is perfectly legal, but there's a kind of, it's a moral question. Do you feel it's right? And, we see Burnham kind of feeling uncomfortable at the way the tardigrade is being used. And it's interesting, if you look compared to, say, The Measure of a Man, where it was all about, is Data sentient? If he's sentient, then that's the key thing. They say the tardigrade is probably sentient. Clearly Saru is sentient. It's somehow that's not really the issue anymore. In the same way as, we've had these debates recently in the UK about animal sentience. And the general view seems to be there's not really any question that animals are sentient. There are other justifications that are used for the way that they're treated. But this idea that, sort of we saw with Data, that, is he just a thing? He's not really a being, is kind of pushed away by now. And I wonder if that's why the way that Discovery deals with, say, the issue of the tardigrade, it's not, I'm going to report you to Starfleet for abusing this creature. This goes against all our rules. Even as we saw in Voyager with those creatures that were being used in a similar way in Equinox, it's much more a sort of moral discomfort and a kind of empathy that we see with Burnham. She has that dream where she sees herself in the animal's position and empathizes with what it must be like for it to suffer in that way. So it's definitely a sort of different approach from the traditional Star Trek approach to these issues, which is kind of, can we pin it down? And, say with the exocomps, can we say, are they alive or not? And Data's trying to look up definitions and ask Dr. Crusher for a definition. And, Measure of a Man, it's very much about kind of defining the boundaries of all these things. Actually, Discovery seems less interested in these kind of philosophical boundaries and more interested in just the kind of a more sort of empathetic response to the suffering of another being and how you kind of morally square that.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, should we move on to the big mid-season finale? Mm-hmm. Into the Forest I Go.
Yeah, and I guess there's, two things that sort of jumped out at me about this episode. The first is the title. Again, we have a title. We're not quite sure what it refers to. We get a sense of, obviously, it's sort of heading into something that sounds quite sort of, it's good for a mid-season finale. It sounds kind of exciting and mysterious and possibly a bit dangerous. But it's also, again, somewhat obscure. We have that line from Stamets when he has his sort of, he's seen something about the universe or about the multiverse or whatever, and he says, there's a clearing through the woods or something. Again, totally opaque language, basically. We don't really know what he's talking about. But I suppose what it made me think of, this idea of the forest, is we have this sort of idea. I don't know if you're familiar with the musical Into the Woods, but that very much plays on this idea of sort of in fairy tales that the woods or the forest is where you go, which this quote is kind of alluding to. You go and you sort of lose yourself and you find something else and you kind of grow up, and so some kind of transformation. Or alternatively, we see it, say, in Dante, the first lines of the Inferno, I found myself, however it goes, he finds himself lost in a wood, basically. And the wood is the kind of, slightly dark, slightly dangerous, sort of where we end up, and we're kind of lost and we're not sure what's happening. And, can we find our way through it? And who will we be kind of when we get to the other side? So to me, that title, it sort of has all those resonances without, again, quite being sure exactly what it refers to, other than that it seems to be this quote from John Muir, I think he's called, and the line is, into the forest I go to lose my mind and find my soul, which obviously makes sense for Stamets to a certain extent. He seems to be losing his mind. It maybe makes sense for Burnham as this kind of redemptive, finding her soul, somehow this kind of redemptive journey. But in terms of kind of thematic things, the thing that really jumps out to me about this episode, and again, it's something that's kind of been threaded through, that we picked up in Choose Your Pain, is this idea of post-traumatic stress, really, and the way that issue is handled. Again, a mental health issue is handled in relation to the Tyler character. I talked a bit about Tyler as this potential sort of Manchurian candidate, and I think all of that is one aspect of his character. There's also this real sort of interest in this trauma that he's gone through. And I know a lot of people have questioned how they're going to resolve this in a way that sort of respects both parts of that, because obviously the danger is I think for a while people were concerned if he turns out to be a villain in disguise, then all this trauma is sort of fake trauma somehow. Whereas it seems by this final episode that possibly there's been some kind of, like, his memories are, I don't know, maybe they're a bit confused, or there's a kind of element of the fact that he's not really sure what's going on kind of plays into it. But certainly we see this idea of him as being this traumatized character. The first time we meet him, he's, as Mudd says, out to lunch. He's very much, he seems to be a sort of shell-shocked character. He's kind of cowering in the corner, basically. And then in this episode, we see him have this very strong, post-traumatic reaction, basically, when he's there with Admiral Cornwall, and he essentially is unable, he does at the very end, he sort of snaps out of it to an extent, but he's basically unable to function in his role as the head of security. And I think it's a very interesting and sort of brave choice in a way, particularly with a male character, particularly with this quite heroic character, to show not just to show someone suffering with their demons and being tormented by war and their experiences and so on, which we've kind of seen before, but to show the extent to which it completely cripples his ability to function. He's even more so than, say, someone like Picard, who's traumatized by his experiences with the Borg or so on. Tyler is literally like Cornwell, I think, says to Burnham, he's no use to you. You basically have to write him off at this point. He's too ill right now to function in this mission. He can't do it. And I think that's quite an interesting thing to see in this sort of male heroic character. And even more so when you bring in this element of kind of sexual assault, and the way that that's handled, and the way that he talks to Burnham about what's happened to him and this relationship with L'Rell. And again, it's very interesting that it's a man telling that to a woman, because more commonly, probably, it would be the gender situation would be reversed, if you know what I mean. It would be a woman describing the sexual assault to the male partner and him being the supportive one. In this instance, it's the other way around. And I think they go quite, there's quite a lot of sensitivity in terms of, I know people had issues with the way some of the flashbacks were presented and so on, but that scene between the two of them, I think, is very well written and very well performed and so on. And it touches on these quite difficult areas. He says things like, I encouraged it. And the element of kind of shame, I suppose, that he feels about what's happened to him, and the extent to which, and we hear this with people who've been raped or who've been assaulted or whatever, who felt they were under a threat of danger or something, and then they feel, well, did I sort of go along with it because I didn't want to, be murdered or whatever it is, and all these kind of complex, difficult feelings. And I sort of feel, broadly speaking, it seems to have been dealt with very well, I think, in Discovery. I think they've taken that, as it happens, very topical. They couldn't possibly have known how topical that issue would be, but, coincidentally really kind of ripped from the headlines, sort of issue at a time like this, and done a really good job of presenting that in a kind of serious, thoughtful, interesting way. I just hope that they do manage to find a way to kind of resolve those lingering questions about Tyler's character in a way that kind of makes all that continue to hold together.
Yeah, for sure. Well, there's a lot of stuff over the course of this, and we're only halfway through. I mean, well, maybe a little bit more than halfway through, but still, it's like, boy, we've gone from everything from, World War II politics to, the meat packing industry and everything in between, Alice in Wonderland. It's crazy. Do you have, there's no way to predict this, of course, but do you have any thoughts as to what you're looking forward to or hoping to see or think we will see in the second half?
It's tricky, isn't it? Yeah, I think just to respond to what you were saying, we've kind of jumped all over the shop. I think it's reassuring in a way how much stuff there is, and this was my sort of short list of ideas. There's all sorts of other ideas in there. I think this is a very rich show in terms of these kind of historical, literary, context and so on, and these kind of things that they're drawing on, which, is all to the good in a way that it's a show with a lot going on underneath the surface, I suppose, is what I'm saying. In terms of where it goes, it's hard to know, isn't it? It does sound, well, we know that we're going to the mirror universe. It sounds like we're going there sooner rather than later, just from what's been set up. I'm not wild about that. I've never been that, I've enjoyed some of the mirror universe episodes, but they often feel a bit shallow to me. So I'll be interested to see how they handle that. Beyond that, I think it's hard to say. I suppose I do still sort of feel that Lorca is not going to be a long-term prospect on this show. I feel like his kind of crisis has got to, or his storyline's got to kind of come to a head at some point. And my suspicion is he's not going to be around forever. As I said, I had always sort of thought there'd be some kind of mutiny brewing or something. But on the other hand, he doesn't seem to have quite gone in that direction yet. So I suppose it depends on what the fallout is of what he's done in this last episode. Obviously, we know he's done something kind of shady. We know he's done other pretty shady things in the past, and sort of where that leads to. But one of the things that actually I really enjoy about Discovery is not really knowing where it's going. And quite unusually for Star Trek, partly just because it's new, but also because it is quite kind of twisty and turny and quite strange. I said this when we did this episode of The Edge about Context is for Kings. That episode was just a complete sort of slap in the face almost. I mean, in a good way, a kind of a bucket of water in the face, because it was kind of the previous two felt more familiar in some ways as Star Trek. That ship felt more familiar, the kind of camaraderie of the crew and so on. And then when we hit the Discovery, it was just like, what on earth is this? This is not what we're used to at all. And week after week, there are these kind of weird episodes that are not what we're expecting. Magic to make the sanest man go mad. I love that episode, but I don't think anyone was really expecting this sort of knockabout comedy time loop episode to come in the middle of this intense serialized war story. So I guess the thing that I'm enjoying most about Discovery is really not knowing where it's going and being surprised by it week on week.
I agree about that 100%, and I'm very excited to see where it's going, mainly because I have no idea where it's going. So it'll be fun to see. We'll have to regroup after the season is over with and take a look at the last 6 episodes and see what we can pick out of those as well, for sure. All right. Well, it's been fun talking about the various primitive culture type of things going on in Star Trek Discovery this week, but that's not all we're talking about here on Trek FM. So here's a look at what you may have missed elsewhere on the network.
Previously on Trek.fm, The Edge, a Star Trek Discovery podcast.
Even with the animated show, I know it was Gene Roddenberry's wish that the animated show not be considered canon, but so much of what we know about Star Trek comes from the animated show, what Kirk's, the name is, and what, to hear Tiberius, I think, for the first time is in the animated show, if I'm not mistaken.
The Orb.
But also, Rom, in the end, obviously kind of has a heart of gold. He's a guy who just wants to take care of people. He really likes people. And that's kind of who Lita is, too. And so they're really kind of kindred spirits.
To the journey!
And Chakotay looks amazing in his fatigues.
He does.
Hands down.
He does.
Everyone likes a man in uniform, yes.
Well, unless it's a Nazi uniform, then no.
Or a woman in uniform.
Yes.
We're an equal opportunities podcast.
Earl Grey.
So this goes, I chose from Justice.
It's a Wesley moment.
I knew I was gonna catch flack for that. No, it's not a Wesley moment. I was actually thinking about doing that, but yeah, no.
And that's what else is happening on Trek.fm.
Check out these shows and discover what we're talking about in your favorite corner of the Star Trek universe. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. If you're an Apple user, be sure to hit the subscribe button in Apple Podcasts on the iPhone or iPad or Apple TV or the desktop iTunes app to get the latest episodes as soon as they're published. And please leave us a star rating and a review. If you're not an Apple user, we've got you covered as well. You can find our shows on Google Play Music, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spreaker, SoundCloud, Windows Phone, and in most third-party apps. And you can stream and download the MP3 file from our website or grab the RSS link as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode, and there's a lot of ways that you can contact us. The best place is to join the larger conversation in the Babel Conference, which is our listeners group on Facebook. Just type Babel, that's Babel, into the search field on Facebook, and we should come right up. If you'd like to send us an email, you can use the form on our website at trek.fm/contact. Just choose to send to a show and select The Edge, and that'll come right to us. You can also find the network on Twitter at TrekFM and on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. So, Duncan, where can people find you here on the network and elsewhere on the internet?
Well, you can find me hosting Primitive Culture, Trek FM's podcast all about our history, our culture, and how Star Trek relates to it. And you can find me frequently on the Babel Conference, or if you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is @Barrett'sBooks.
Excellent. And you can find me right here on the network doing a show called Stage 9, and you can also find me on thenerdparty.com doing a show called Great Shot Kid, and on my website, commentarytrackstars.com, doing a show called Commentary Trackstars. And you can find me on Twitter at Mumbles3K. We'd like to thank our associate producers today, Norman C. Lau, Tony Robinson, Lisa Slack, Tom Puleo, Shoaib Mirza, Richard Rutledge, and James Muldrow. Thank you very much, everybody. If you want to be like our associate producers, you can become a patron of the network on patreon.com/trekfm. If you head on over there, that's patreon.com/trekfm. You can get all the details, including perks like early access to episodes, exclusive content, producer credits, and more available through our special patrons website, Patron Zone. It requires a great deal of money to produce, host, and distribute these shows each month, and we really appreciate any support you can give us and hope you'll join the team. Again, you'll find all the details at patreon.com/trekfm. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Duncan. It was it was a lot of fun. And, if people want to get more of this, head on over to Primitive Culture and you can hear, Duncan along with Tony talking about this all the time. But until next time, thanks for everyone for listening, and we will see you next time on The Edge.